In baseball, we all have different opinions on what makes a player valuable, and there's a handful of different ways to evaluate players. You have the old school way of scouting, the good old eye test, where you just watch a player do his thing and you see what jumps out at you. You have the traditional stats that you'd see in a box score like home runs, strikeouts, batting average, ERA, and more recently, we have advanced stats and WAR. WAR stands for wins above replacement, and it was made to take everything that a player does and put it into one number to measure how valuable that player's been to their team. Zero WAR is your replacement level player, that first guy that's going to get called up from AAA to fill in when somebody on the major league team gets hurt or traded or cut or whatever. 2 WAR is your everyday starter in the major leagues, 5 WAR is an all-star level player, and 8 or more is your MVP Cy Young caliber player. For position players, WAR takes their hitting, base running, and defense and puts it all together into a total value for that player. And if you want to find out more about WAR for position players, this video is part 2. I'll put a link to the first video in the description below. But for pitchers, this gets a bit more complicated. See, it's tougher to evaluate the impact that a pitcher has on the game because it starts to get debatable what's actually in a pitcher's control and how valuable certain parts of pitching actually are. So this is where we start to get into the 2 types of WAR. That's bWAR from Baseball Reference and fWAR from Fangraphs. And there's also a third stat that might honestly be the best of all 3 of these, so make sure you stick around to the end for that little bonus. Both sites start with 1,000 WAR per 162 games to give out to all of the players in Major League Baseball. The reason they pick 1,000 is because if you had a whole team of replacement level players, this would put their value at a 294 winning percentage. I don't know how exactly they decided that's how good a replacement level player is, but somebody that's way smarter than me went and did the math on it, okay? Baseball Reference gives 590 of this to position players and 410 to pitchers, while Fangraphs gives 570 of that to position players and 430 to pitchers. So Fangraphs gives a little more value to pitchers than Baseball Reference does. But now we get to the real difference between these two, and that's the main stat that they each use to figure out a pitcher's value. So let's start with the more straightforward one here, and that's going to be bWAR. And to compare all these stats together, we're going to use Braxton Garrett as our example, starting pitcher for the Miami Marlins. Garrett is 26 in his 4th season, drafted 7th overall by the Marlins in 2016, and peaked as the number 43 prospect in baseball in 2017. He made his debut back in 2020, but only pitched in 10 games between then and 2021. Then he made 17 starts last season. This season, he's pitched in 22 games, starting 21 of them, and in 111 innings has a 4.14 ERA, which has him 46th out of 81 pitchers with at least 100 innings this season. But there's more to his talent here than his middle-of-the-road ERA makes it look at first. So let's start getting into his WAR. So for Baseball Reference's version of WAR, they use runs allowed per 9 innings, which is just the total amount of runs that got scored while a pitcher was on the mound divided by the innings that he pitched times 9. So it's the average amount of runs that would get scored in a full 9-inning game with this dude on the mound. So then to get a player's bWAR, as simply as I can put this, Baseball Reference takes a pitcher's runs allowed per 9 and it compares it to the average amount of runs that the offense they're pitching against would be expected to score in the time that this guy was on the mound. Then it adjusts this for 3 things. The park that the pitcher was pitching in, because some parks are better for hitters, some parks are better for pitchers, the defense behind the pitcher by taking the percentage of the team's balls in play that this pitcher allowed and multiplying that by the team's total defensive runs saved. I'll put an example on the screen to help this make more sense. And then for whether the pitcher is either a starter or a reliever, because relievers tend to have lower ERAs since starters have to come in and pace themselves to try to throw 6, 7, 8, 9 innings. A reliever just gets to come in, go maximum effort for 1 inning and call it a day. You then take this and compare the pitcher's value against what a replacement level player would be expected to do in that same situation. And after a couple minor tweaks that I'm not going to bore you with, that's your bWAR. Now the main problem with this version of WAR is that runs allowed per 9 doesn't factor in like unearned runs or specifically what a pitcher did or didn't do to help prevent runs. It's just straight up, if a run got scored while you're on the mound, it's your fault. Now their reasoning behind this is that they're more worried about giving credit for what happened instead of trying to figure out why it happened or be able to project it happening again. Basically, they're just results over process. So looking at Garrett and his 4.14 ERA, when we add in all of his runs, he sits at 4.3 runs allowed per 9 and a bWAR of 1.6, which has him 78th in the league out of all pitchers, not just the 81 we talked about earlier. So for a point of reference, Garrett Cole is in first place with 4.9 bWAR, and he has 2.76 runs allowed per 9. So going just off of how many runs have been scored with Garrett on the mound, he's nowhere near the top pitchers in baseball. But keeping in mind the problems with runs allowed per 9 and bWAR as a whole, this isn't even close to how good he's actually been pitching. And this is what brings us to fWAR, and the main stat that Fangraphs uses for their version of WAR, and that's FIP. FIP, or fielding independent pitching, was created as a way to measure a pitcher's performance by taking the defense out of the equation. Strikeouts, walks, hit batters, and home runs are the only outcomes that don't involve the defense. So the idea was that these are the only things that are really actually under a pitcher's control. So FIP adds up all the values of these for a pitcher: 13 for home runs, 3 for walks and hit batters, and -2 for strikeouts, which is based roughly on run expectancy, and it divides this by the innings pitched and sets it on a scale so that it's similar to the league ERA. The league FIP every year should match the league ERA. So to get a pitcher's fWAR, we take their FIP, but we also have to add in infield fly balls the same as we do strikeouts. And the reasoning why these are counted the same is because basically, at the major league level, these should be sure outs regardless of who's back there playing defense. Any defender at the major league level should be able to field an infield fly ball. And these are hit shallow enough that runners don't advance. So you basically get the same outcome as a strikeout, barring something crazy happening on either of these. We take this new form of FIP and we change it from the ERA scale that it's normally on to a runs allowed per 9 scale so that it's going to match up with bWAR. Then you adjust this for the ballpark just the same as Baseball Reference, but Fangraphs only adjust this for the player's home ballpark, and then you compare all this to the average pitcher in the same league as the pitcher, so the AL or the NL. You basically then take the pitcher's value and compare it versus your replacement level pitcher. Again, you make some minor tweaks to it that I'm not going to get into, and this all gives you your fWAR, which also does have an adjustment for relievers, but this one's different. It's based more on the situation that the pitcher was pitching in. So higher leverage situations, late inning games, close games, that gets you more value than a lower leverage situation does. So now if we look at Garrett again, and more specifically how he's fared in terms of FIP, he's been getting a good amount of strikeouts, 26.3% of the time, and really limiting the walks at 4.1%, which is under half of the MLB average. But he has been a bit below average in terms of home runs, with his homers per 9 just a tick worse than average. He's also barely getting any infield fly balls at 2.3% of the time, and he's hit 8 batters so far, which has him tied for 7th. So adding all this up gets Garrett to a 3.56 FIP, which now has him as the 15th best pitcher of our 81, which is a huge difference between his ERA and bWAR and what that says about him as a pitcher. But just because, in my opinion at least, fWAR does a better job of measuring a pitcher's true talent, that doesn't mean that it's without its own flaws. See, the main problem with FIP is that by not taking into consideration the balls that are getting put into play against a pitcher, you're cutting out a huge part of what's happening. And I think it's wrong to say the pitcher has no control over what kind of batted balls they allow. See, we have ground ball pitchers and fly ball pitchers for a reason. Because guys that work more at the bottom of the zone, or they have really heavy downward action on their pitches, they're better at getting ground balls. Whereas guys that have high spin rate fastballs that hang up longer, they're gonna live more at the top of the zone, and they're gonna get more fly balls because of that. So leaving this out of our evaluation of pitchers isn't giving us the whole picture. And that's where our final stat comes in: SIERA. SIERA stands for Skill Interactive ERA, and the simplest way that I can put this is that it's similar to FIP, but it also takes batted ball data into account, and it's also adjusted for the league-wide run environment, as well as some other trends that the guys who made this noticed while they were evaluating pitchers. The main takeaways that they added into their calculations is that it gives more credit for strikeouts than FIP does, because high strikeout pitchers tend to get weaker contact, which results in less hits from a lower BABIP, or batting average on balls in play, and less home runs from a lower homer to fly ball ratio. It also says that walks are less harmful for a low walk pitcher, because walking a guy when there's already somebody on, whether you gave up a single or another walk before that, you now just put somebody into scoring position. So that's way worse than a control artist giving up a walk because they're just pitching around somebody like Ohtani or Judge or whoever, because you're trying not to just make a really hittable mistake to that guy. They also noticed that the more grounders that a pitcher gets, the lower their BABIP on those ground balls usually is, and the more fly balls that a pitcher gets, the lower their homers per fly ball. Because the better that you are at missing a hitter's barrel, and again, this is a skill in either direction, the weaker the contact's gonna be, because if you can get guys more underneath or more on top, they're not hitting the ball as squarely. And finally, like we've talked about with relievers, typically only coming in to go max effort for 1 inning, they usually have a lower BABIP and homers per fly ball than starters do. So adding in these last pieces here for Garrett, his 48.9% ground ball rate is well above average, 14th out of our 81 pitchers. And getting this many ground balls is huge, because while they may have a bit higher BABIP than fly balls do, you give up way less damage on grounders because you very rarely see them go for extra base hits, as well as the fact that you can turn double plays on grounders too and just wipe out a base hit or a walk that you just gave up. Now, he is giving up a pretty high 17% homer to fly ball ratio, and his 330 BABIP is 3rd in the league, which could point to some bad luck, but he's also got FanGraphs' 29th ranked defense behind him, so imagine how his numbers would look if he had at least an average defense behind him, and if he can start getting just a little bit weaker contact, which he's done before. This is actually the hardest that he's been hit in any of his 4 seasons so far. So finally, taking as much of his pitching into consideration as we can, Garrett is sitting pretty with a 3.29 SIERA. That's 4th in baseball out of our 81 pitchers over 100 innings. This was a guy that by ERA was average at best. Evaluating pitchers is tough. There's so much that goes into it that it can be really hard to say what exactly is the pitcher's skill and where he's kind of getting helped out a bit. The beauty of baseball nowadays is that we have access to all these numbers with just a couple clicks, so we can go and find how good a pitcher is at what we think is the most important part of pitching pretty easy. If it's all about keeping runs from crossing the plate, no matter how you do it, bWAR is for you. If you want to see a bit more of the underlying skill that a pitcher has, you probably prefer fWAR. And if you like to get way into the weeds on this stuff and think about everything that goes into pitching, you can come and take a seat right here next to me and SIERA. But like I said in the position player video, the best option is to probably compare everything that we have so that you can get as well-rounded of an idea of a player as possible. So let me know what you think about all this. Which version of WAR do you prefer? Or do you like SIERA now instead? Or how do you like to evaluate pitchers? Comment all your thoughts down below. Also, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help the channel and so that you don't miss out on any baseball content like this. You can check out that position player WAR video down in the description, or the video that's on your screen now about how this Mets team that went as all in as you can possibly go to try to win a World Series was blown up after only half of a season. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have an awesome day. Later.